This is a really important piece of this work, is getting community feedback from the work we've done. So my name is Susie Godber, and this is John Phillips, who will be speaking to you today. We are with Parametrics, who's the consultant who is helping support Island County in doing their climate element work and working on the resiliency sub-element. So we're just really excited to share with you kind of some of the things that we found, but really most importantly, we want to hear from you and hear what your concerns are as community members, people who live here, so we can make sure that all of those priorities are integrated into the upcoming comprehensive plan update. And also, I think what would be really great is if everybody could go around the room and share who they are, specifically the participants who you're with, who you're affiliated with, and your name, and maybe where you live. And we can start.
I'll start.
Yeah.
My name is John Roberts. I am co-owner of Cascade Custom Homes and Design here in Cootville. We are custom home builders and remodelers. We work on the entire extent of the island. I've lived here for 58 years, and I'm a fourth generation family. I live in Santa Fe.
I'm Christina Hines. I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Development Council for Island County.
I'm Randy Perry. I'm the Director of Public Works for the City of Langley and also the President of the Whidbey Island Water System Association.
And my name is John Levy. I live down in Bayview near Sunlight Beach. And as Randy's wearing the Langley hat, I'm representing the Thanks for waiting to park.
Richard Gavin, retired University of Washington professor of chemistry, and I'm here representing the climate action near Langley.
Jake Stewart, living in Clinton, a 24-acre agroforestry farm there. We are representing small farmers, scientists by training, but here as a farmer.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Bennett, and I'm pleased to report to you from the Marine Resources Committee.
I'm Marnie Jackson, and I'm the Executive Director with the Environmental Action.
So today, just to give you an overview, Susie kind of touched on it. Our goal is just to kind of get some information from you. And now I'm nervous because you're going to know a heck of a lot more about sea level rise than I do. Be like a doctoral dissertation for me. Please feel free to critique anything you'd like. I'm open to that. So my name is John Phillips, work for Parametrics. I've been working on climate issues in the Puget Sound region for a number of years. We're excited about these climate elements. We're happy that the state has put those in there, not just because it gives us something to do, but also because I think it's an important aspect, and having it in the comprehensive plan is a great place to have it. But with that, we really have to talk to people and understand what those impacts are and how they're going to impact. We don't claim to be experts on Whidbey Island. I visit here quite often. I like Whidbey Island. I live across the water in Everett, so I'm here quite often. My wife grew up here on Skagit Head. Her family had land there, so like I've been here, but we're not experts by any stretch of the imagination. That's what you're here to give us good feedback on as we talk through some of these issues. Ask questions as I'm talking, figure out how that applies to whoever you're represented, or just in general, like how does that apply to your community? Because we want to hear those things about like where does that hit you in the community? What's making you anxious about that? Today's about sea level rise. Sea level rise does a lot of things, right? It's just not the water getting higher. There's other things that are going to happen here when the water gets higher. So with that, we really want to just talk about kind of the, once we're done with this, we'll kind of do like a little next step. This is a really short presentation. I'm not going to talk for very long about sea level rise, but we're going to give you a good overview of what's going on, what we've observed, and what we've kind of gleaned from the information that we can, both from what Island County staff has already done, what we know about the community, what we can find out through data sources, other existing plans that we've read about Island County and the different communities in Island County, just so we get a good understanding. But that's just for us to understand where we're starting. Our big goal is to come out with some ideas and consequences, and then how we're going to address those consequences through action. And then we'll take those actions, and that's what we want you all to think about: action. Don't think about like what a policy should be or something like that or a goal. Think about the actions we should be taking. We've got folks that can sit down and start working in the policies. We'll come back. We'll talk about those policies, how they sound. Obviously, the county will want to weigh in quite a bit on those policies and goals. But what we want to think about is action, right? What can we do to fix that? What's a good way to get around that? How can we mitigate for that hazard? Those are the type of things we want you all to be thinking about today. We're going to do some exercises to make you think. So if you didn't get your coffee, maybe you'll want to get a copy because it's going to be a lot of your thinking and your ideas, getting them up on Post-it notes so we can record them, and then kind of bringing those back. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we keep talking about this climate element. This is new. This is the first year. There's no road book or roadmap on how to do this. We, the universal we that have to work in the comp planning field and the consultants and the staff that support this, we're doing this for the first time. We're kind of, hate to say this, building the airplane as we go because the direction we have from the Department of Commerce and from the state is very limited at this point because they're still going through their rulemaking process. Typically how it does, right? A law passes, we all look at it, we read through it and say, okay, we can figure out how to do this. But we do know we have to assess climate change here in Whidbey and Camino Island. We have to highlight where there's vulnerable impacts to local community, and we have to consider the equity of that. We have to consider how does that affect overburdened communities? How does that affect people that are older? How does that affect people of color? How does that affect the fishermen? How does that affect the farmers? We have to think about all those things to make sure we're looking at the whole community, not just a certain aspect of the community, not just the homes on the beach, but all the homes around that area too that might be impacted. And we'll talk a little bit about those kind of considered of consequences of compounding impacts from sea level rise as we go through. So, and of course, in the law, there's 3 requirements for the resiliency. Looking at the hazards, sea level rise, landslides, smoke, wildfire, heat, and we have 3 workshops. This is the first one on sea level rise. Next week, we're going to be talking about changing precipitation patterns or different way it will rain or not rain in the future, and also talk a little bit about heat, which everybody's like, why are we going to talk about heat? It's going to be hot. So we should talk about how that might impact, especially some of the more vulnerable populations, even the unvulnerable population, because none of us likes 90-degree weather. I know that. I've lived here long enough. We want to be able to protect natural areas and the habitat and the species that use that. We want to do our best to figure out how we can protect that into the future. And also we want to make sure we're looking at the social economic impacts of what might happen. So that's why there's such a group. You heard farmers, you heard economic development, how builders, people concerned about climate, people concerned about natural resources, all at the same table because we want to make sure we cover our basis on that. Because it isn't just about the natural hazards, it's about the other hazards that come out of that and how does that impact it. One of the things we're not going to talk about is ocean acidification, but we did put it in the plan because this is a prime national spot for growing oysters and mussels. So we do have that. It's there. We're understanding it. We're going to keep it as part of one of the impacts of climate change for this area in Puget Sound. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk specifically about sea level rise. So we talked a little bit about the process. So we've had a few months working with Emily and Jonathan and the folks at Island County to kind of start bringing all the data we can find together, especially data about the different impacts. And we've also started assessing the vulnerabilities. We sent out kind of what we call a story map a couple weeks ago. And that has a lot of information that we've got very high level. We put all that into a database. We can actually use a database as georeference. It's called Geographic Information, or GIS. And we can take all that data and actually put it into a database and also georeference that data. So we understand how different parts of the island are impacted by climate change. Different parts of the island, what are those social characteristics we want to look at? What are some other things that we should be considering? All the data and information that's out there, we try to get into like a geographic database. And we've given you some snapshots of what we're looking at in the story. So we've done that. We call that assessing the vulnerabilities. So we kind of understand there's some vulnerabilities out there, but again, we only know what's written down. We don't know what's in people's heads. And right now, we're starting to think about goals and policies. So our first step in developing goals and policies, like I said earlier, is developing some actions that we can think about. What do we want to do about X? What do we want to do about Y? I'm going to go through that. Every workshop's going to be exactly like this in the format, just different information. Meanwhile, Island County staff are working on the rest of the comp plan and having outreach activities about that. And we also have to think about that from a climate perspective. We have to look at what other information comes up. What's going on with housing? What's going on with capital facilities? What's going on with utilities? What's going on with transportation? So really quickly, I'm going to go over sea level rise. And what does that mean? What does that look like for Island County? Very high level information. If you want to really read into it, University of Washington has excellent papers on this. They've been thinking about it for a very long time. Far back as I don't want to say. They've been working on sea level rise. But really where we're starting is we're going to start with global sea level rise. The Earth is heating up. That means the oceans are getting warmer. And as everybody knows who's boiled over a pot of water, as things get warmer, the water expands. So that's our first thing. We'll call that thermal expansion. That's causing the global sea level rise to change and increase over time. Now we have to kind of get it down to what's happening here in Puget Sound and what's unique about Puget Sound. So very specifically, there are studies on sea level rise in Puget Sound. I've listed off, the first projections came out in 2008, and that was from the University of Washington. And they were very adamant about the fact that sea level rise is not equal across Puget Sound. Even though it's a bathtub, there's another issue going on here in Puget Sound. The land's moving. Not at a rapid pace, but rapid from a geological sense of view, that we do have land that subsides and land that rises. So for instance, if you're in Neah Bay, and we're talking about sea level rise, it's a different discussion because their sea level rise is actually positive. Their land is going up faster than sea level. And then when we come into Seattle in this area, we're actually going, if you can think about the plates going like this, actually the land is going down, subsiding. So we have to think about land subsidence, vertical land movement, when we think about sea level rise and what's going to happen, because it's not going to be equal. I do a little tiny presentation where I talk about the West Coast perspective on sea level rise to the East Coast perspective. You can look at tide gauges over the last 100 years on the East Coast and a pretty steady up. If you look at all the tide gauges on the West Coast, starting in Alaska, they're all over the place. Some go this way, some go that way. Some are going up, some are going down. Juneau actually is gaining height over time. San Diego is not. San Francisco had a little event that caused their actual sea level rise to change back in the 1900s, very early 1900s. Very unique on the West Coast that not everybody is experiencing sea level rise the same way. So we have very specific studies to look at sea level rise in Puget Sound. We use those. That's what we're kind of basing a lot of our information on. Very nice little website out there that we use to kind of get projections in sea level rise. And I can stand here on Whidbey Island and get a projection for the north end of the island and a projection for the south end of the island, because it's enough resolution to say that. Is it that vastly different? Not really, because we're looking at projections out into the future. When we look at projections out into the future, there's a lot of uncertainty. So we use ranges. We can say sea level rise is going to increase 1.5 to 3 feet over the next 50 years here on Whidbey Island. That's what we're dealing with. We're grappling with that much difference. What's the difference with a half a foot? Well, half a foot to difference between a seawall here or a seawall there. Or a half a foot is this plant being underwater or this plant not being underwater. So a half a foot matters. Doesn't sound like much, but it does. Next. So here are our sea level rise projections out to 2100. Like I said, a 3-foot increase is what we're going to base a lot of our information on, because that could be basically a scenario where we can see a lot of impacts. Now that's just sea level rise. You all know what a king tide is. We've all experienced king tides. So we know what a king tide is. That's an additional 3 feet. And that's going to continue to happen. With the base elevation, the sea level rise going up 3 feet, you can still get every 10 years or so another 3.2, 3.3 feet of king tides. So think about it from that perspective. Those same things that are impacting us now with high tides are going to continue into the future. What we've done, and this is one of those instances where we got a lot of data. This is housing values that are impacted by 3 feet of sea level. The darker the color, the more housing value that's impacted. Just one data set, right? We can also overlay that with people over 65. We can put information in there on people's houses who were built prior to 1960. We can do all kinds of different things to look at that, but here, because we're looking at this from a hazard perspective, this is the economic value of the parcels that are impacted by sea level rise. And it's an estimate, not precise. Next. So the compounding hazard, I just talked about king tides and storm surge. But we talked about that a little bit. Storm surge is basically what happens in Puget Sound. We don't get storm surges like they do in the hurricanes. But we do get them. We get very low pressure systems over Puget Sound. allows that tide to be higher than predicted, somewhere up in the range of like 3 feet or so. We can still get king tides. That's sometimes where king tides. King tides are different though. That's an astronomical event, right? The tides get higher because the moon's closer during the winter time. Between November and February, the moon's closer to the Earth. Therefore, the tides are relatively higher in the winter than they are in the summer. That's not going to change, cross our fingers, over the next 50 years. But we have to account for that as well as we start seeing sea level rise. These sea level elevations change over time because of what the heating of the ocean is. We'll also see other hazards, right? We'll see streams and rivers that get backed up because of sea level rise. We'll see erosion. We'll see coastal areas being eroded away, beaches having less of that, the bluffs along the beaches getting undercut from the sea level rise. And also we'll see rising water tables too. And the salt water sits under the fresh water. So that fresh water actually comes up to the surface. And in some areas of Puget Sound, that's happening right now. When there's a high tide, there's actually what they call groundwater flooding, where water pops up from the surface. And when he kind of looks at it, goes, where is this coming from? And then, of course, lots of ecosystems. One of the things we want to accomplish. So the consequences, and one of the unique things we found about Island County is the way that the community is kind of divided up. These residential community zones on the shoreline and what they are, whether they're historic canals and other coastal areas. And we're going to go through each of those because that's what we want to look at as far as, how does that impact housing as far as sea level rise? Next slide. Are you going right to ground? We've done a really good job of breaking down those different categories when you're in the story map of the different housing types along the shoreline. Yeah. I don't know if you can read the legend up there. It's kind of bright today. But the canal, the shoreline residential, high intensity, and the historic beach community. So we're looking at that from that lens. That's how Island County is looking at it. That's the way we look at it. And we mentioned, let's go to ground. We mentioned the groundwater table rise from saltwater intrusion because of the sea level going up. That water can actually come under and raise the fresh water. So that's something we're looking at. We're looking at both from this perspective and how that fits in with changing precipitation patterns in our next workshop. And also looking at the damage that might happen because all that groundwater is coming up to the surface. Now, in a lot of areas, that's significant flooding that will happen when the tide's high and actually flood out areas. Matter of fact, right up on Fidalgo Island behind the high school, Anacortes High School, there's a big area that floods during high tides, and it just kind of pops up from the surface. Next slide. So the infrastructure damage we're talking about, well, the first most obvious one from the sea level rise is going to be roads, right? Roads are going to be washed away, roads are covered with debris, a little bit of both, make them impassable during high tides. There's a few roads right now that we've seen damage to during normal high tides right now. So in the future, those will get worse, and we're going to make sure we identify the roads. Also, anything that's underground. Any of the underground infrastructure, we have to account for anything that might happen to that. You have a lot of infrastructure coming across the water too that I've encountered. You have power lines, gas lines, because you're fed through that area. You need to think about how those utilities are impacted by sea level rise. The other thing that happens with sea level rise is once it gets up and starts covering areas that haven't been covered before, if there's any sort of pollution on that land, that gets now washed into the ocean or washed out into a river or into a stream. So we have to think about that too, like what's going to be impacted by sea level rise? Is it places that haven't seen water before? Once that water comes up and sweeps that pollution off, now it's part of the water cycle. We have to think about that area, that impact as well. We see a lot of damage to septic systems. We see a lot of damage to pipelines. I've done studies where we've looked at outfalls that have stormwater and the water coming up through those pipelines because they're not protected from that. So there's a lot of different things we'll be looking at as we look through this. Just to name a few on here. And again, this is up on the story. All right. Questions? Better be questions, because I know I didn't cover that. Except for you.
Can I check on volume too? Are people hearing me okay? We were hoping not to use microphones, but people hearing okay?
Yeah, can you hear me in the back?
Good deal.
Okay.
If we need to, we can do it.
Yes.
Melting ice.
Oh yeah, it's definitely land-based ice is melting because of heating up glaciers and things like that. The Antarctic is a big one. And anyone that studies sea level rise long enough is watching what's going on in the Antarctic. That is definitely a reason why there is more sea level rise, but the big one is just expansion. I did simplify it.
Yeah, that sort of cues up a question related to what projections feed into that 3-foot number. Is there a range of conservative to aggressive projections, and have those sort of tipping point events like the collapse of an ice shelf been factored into the projection of what we're talking about for 2100?
Somewhat. The actual collapse of the ice sheet over the Antarctic is everything, kind of everybody, anxious about that. So that's why it's watched, right? But the actual collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet would cause sea level rise to go up pretty significantly in this area, more than 3 feet. 3 feet is a conservative projection into the future. Like I said, it's about 1.5 is kind of low end, 3 feet. Now, the other thing I'll say is we're saying 2100 into the century. I'm going to put it more into the century because as we start looking at the new global climate information that's coming out, things are starting to happen a little bit faster than they did 10 years ago. So we need to look at those numbers as we're going to reach that number someday. It may not be in our lifetime, but that number is going to be reached. And it might be exceeded as it gets warmer. So we're using that as kind of our data point because it does reflect what the University of Washington's kind of put out there for projections, but it also reflects kind of being somewhat conservative about what can happen to sea level rise. Does that make sense? Sure. 3 foot is the 17% chance happening by 2100. If you look at the projections website today.
So when Island County is planning, is that 3-foot projection kind of the standard for what Island County is planning for? Or is there some scenario mapping that would show what would happen if it was worse than we expect and faster than we expect?
Yeah, because we're working on a comprehensive plan, the projections are there just kind of as like, how are we going to look at this? What are the impacts that might happen? But to actually go in and do some scenario planning, say if I was standing here talking about, hey, we need to build a new hospital somewhere on the shoreline, we'd have a different conversation about those projections, but we're using that more for planning purposes, not for actually going into design. I differentiate that because scenario planning is very important, right, when you're doing it, because you do have different outcomes and different tipping points. But because we're talking about a comprehensive plan for a whole community, we want to see how that impacts all those things I listed off at the beginning, different types of housing infrastructure, utility infrastructure, so we'll use that. Now, when we go build new infrastructure, we're going to get a little bit more precise. And we're going to talk about, like, what's the scenario for this facility if we build it out to 6 feet of sea level rise or 5 feet of sea level rise.
And would that also account for when we permit building, for instance, by a homeowner on a residential lot? Are we going to do scenario planning before issuing a permit, or are we using the projections that are being talked about here?
I'm going to let the county answer. I don't think we've decided yet.
I don't think we've decided yet. It's too early. Yeah, that's part of this process.
Yeah, it's definitely in the process.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have an approximate number for the number of residential dwellings that are within a few feet of the high tide line?
The actual number itself?
How many houses?
We do, but I don't know it offhand.
I think we have it on here.
I think we have it on here, actually. Yeah, we actually have it on the slide, but I didn't remember.
Because loss of those would be a big revenue loss for the county.
Yes. So what we've done is we've gone through, and it's been a similar study by the University of Washington, where we looked at the parcel and the parcel value. So we know the loss of value. That is the direct impact of the county, the loss of value. Last question.
Good presentation. Going to my, looking through the, what are you calling it, the storyline?
Yeah.
One comment would be on the way you're doing the color gradients. Human nature is when you see yourself in the light zone, you're good, right? So maybe shifting that to reflect the relative risk of overall risk so that the color gradient doesn't produce that result unintentionally. And the second would be about saltwater intrusion. Obviously, in the farming world, this is a topic. Are you opening the board to this discussion, or did you just want questions about? presentation. I don't want to get ahead of the agenda.
Well, let's do questions on the presentation first, and then, yes, we will be
Okay.
getting into the, exactly what you want to say.
Gotcha. So my comment would be just, reflecting, we don't want to underplan the extremity scenario. So I think that that's something we should spend some time on. I know UW Climate Group is for Island County now projecting a 5-foot sea level rise for 2100. So we've already got a little gap there that we need to look at. You know, maybe it's a range with some sort of.
So you're reading 5 feet?
Yeah.
Okay, I just looked at it this morning, I was looking at 3 feet to 80 feet.
Yeah. So on their model extract for the county, that's 5. So
For the high emission scenario.
for the high emission scenario that we're mapping out. Anyway, so it's just presentation for some of us nerds. It makes sense, but I think the coloring would be helpful to shift.
Yes.
Can you help me with the procedure? I was just wondering where this fits with all of the public comments that you received. And have any goals been identified regarding housing? You talked some as housing would be a big theme. Are there any goals in relation to priorities here?
I'm going to let Emily answer.
So part of John and Susie's work in developing a climate element is to come up with goals and policies that will live in the climate sub-element, but they'll also be auditing the rest of our comprehensive plan and making sure that we have corresponding policies in our housing element and our land use element that go hand in hand with what we develop here in the climate element, and they have not done that work yet, so that will be coming as a result of this.
From the back, again.
Unless it's premature, understand for building new construction. Shoreline. What about all the people existing construction? If you go, what's the county's philosophy? My experience is they build close to the shoreline, it's going to let nature do their thing. Too bad you did that. Is there any policies to protect existing structure or destroy it?
No, we wouldn't throw it. That's the, that part, right? There's new houses being built, there's existing infrastructure, other things that are already existing. What?
Together with decreased.
Housing, that's part of this. This is like step 1, and that's like step 5. But now that you've said it, it's set, so it's on the table, right? And it's been set. We've had discussions, but we haven't gotten where we want to have a conversation. We might think of some actions as professionals to say, these are things that can be done. But as far as setting policy or goals, we want to hear.
Curious about the dynamics of freshwater pushing out the saltwater intrusion. Is that a dynamic that might happen, or is it a blending, or is the freshwater goes on top of the salt? You've got storm drain, and you've got increased water as groundwater. Is that possibly something that would act against the saltwater intrusion, or is it a once it's there?
It does. So we can, let's look to the folks in Florida. They track a lot of groundwater. So what's happened in salt? We have a lot of fresh water. More dense, it's sitting below. We've got a nice little tiny. It's the deal. So what happens is the salt water also has enough pressure to keep the salt water from doing the intrusion once the salt water starts moving. Then you
So
have
if you have more fresh water coming down, say, in storm drainage or whatever, then push
Yeah.
back against that saltwater.
And one of the ways to do that is to kind of, so like in Florida, what they do is they pump a lot of fresh water into it to keep that. And that happens actually naturally, right? All this open area that allows water to infiltrate the streams, it gets down to the groundwater, that allows. That's the basic. Yeah.
I'm really confused by that answer, and would just pose to you that that would have to be very specifically researched regarding the differences in the stratigraphy of this part of the world. We're not limestone, we're glacial too.
Right, but we still, I just was using that because they've extracted their groundwater, so they have salt water coming in. They don't have enough groundwater, fresh groundwater. This is typically how it happens here in the Northwest. This is no limestone. We're gonna say, yeah, type of soils we have up here. Fresh water can infiltrate down into the groundwater, thus recharging it with fresh water. The salt water is kept out. You can see kind of that white line where it's got the salt water blend. It's kind of the same thing, but if you were to just come in and pump all the groundwater out, that salt water would then be in the groundwater. You wouldn't have that zone of pressure, right? It keeps the salt water away from the fresh water. And that's what you kind of see on that bottom slide.
I wasn't expecting you to explain all the details.
Oh.
I'm very aware of sea level dynamics and saltwater intrusion, but would just say the analogy to Florida doesn't sit well.
Okay, I won't use Florida anymore as an example. Unless I'm talking about high tide. I can use it again.
John, I'd ask you and Susie to go back to the map where you showed the most vulnerable sections of the two islands in shades of white to brown. There it is. How did you determine the most vulnerable darkest brown areas?
The darkest brown areas are the amount of property value. That's all this is a property value. So the property value exposed to sea level rise is how we came up with that. It's not it's a vulnerability, loss of that type of loss of property, but it's not a vulnerability that we would show on another slide where it might be population characteristics like older adults, children under 5, folks sensitivity indexes where people have chronic diseases or anything like that. So it's a different type of vulnerability. We just kind of put this one up here as one example, but this is basically property value being exposed to sea level rise.
And you showed us another map that I thought showed the most vulnerable areas in Southern California.
Yes, the other one is actually your the way you kind of divide up coastal communities. So it's historic beaches, canal properties.
So this is just a shoreline designation. So this doesn't measure vulnerability so much as it just outlines what's designated and where those communities are. So I think we are looking most closely at historic beach communities and canal communities, which color coded is the kind of bright pink and the kind of limey green. So this isn't quite a vulnerability map, but we have identified where those communities are and how many homes and parcels in those areas could be impacted by 3 feet of sea level rise.
So will we eventually see a map from your studies that show the most vulnerable areas in some collective of information? You look at North Camino, and I think of their sea level being pretty, they're at sea level now, they're building houses, or they have built houses there. Are they the most vulnerable in your bathtub analogy of uneven vulnerability?
Yes, so we have what's called the Climate Vulnerability Index that we're using, and it's an industry-wide way to kind of measure that vulnerability. So we take the capacity of the community to adapt. We take the sensitivity of the community, and then we take the exposure, in this case would be sea level rise, and we score that. So that'll give us a different image with higher scoring vulnerability. In other words, that north, I don't know for sure, but that north end of Camino Island will probably be higher scoring in vulnerability than kind of the central part of Libya. Does that make sense? On the sea level rise assessment. We do that calculation. So that's just data calculation, that's just math. We don't, right now we need to kind of ground truth that information. Like you say, and I agree, North Camino has a lot of homes right at sea level, but so does the area around Clinton near the ferry terminal. So those types of vulnerabilities will pop up on a overall vulnerability score.
And one more follow-on question will that analysis include wave action from shipping units?
We're not doing wave action right now. We know there's wave action. What we just do is add in the storm surge, which is an additional 3 feet of rise, so we can look at that because I think in the next year and a half we should have modeling throughout Puget Sound that shows kind of where waves are more vulnerable. What we can look at and we have looked at is kind of where the drift cells are that move water different directions, so we understand like the direction of that and where are the bluffs vulnerable, where are the communities vulnerable. So we look at a lot of those things, but not a lot of the. We understand how waves occur in Puget Sound. We know they'll occur. What really we want to look at is that long-term kind of surge in water where it overflows the land, sits there for a couple hours, and then kind of comes out as the tide comes up. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, but I would acknowledge that on the west side of the island, with the shipping, there is a non-natural wave action detriment to the shoreline. And that's as important as the moon in my.
Okay.
So if you would please consider that, I appreciate it.
So, sorry, one thing I just wanted to jump in with, if you haven't explored the story map yet that John and Susie put together, please do that. There's a wealth of data and information there. If there's more that you'd like to see or questions you have, we created an online forum for those questions. If you want to see different data points shown, please give us that feedback. That online venue is the best place for that. So I'm going to hand it back to John to kind of continue here. I think we've gotten some good questions under our belt. I'd like to make sure the stakeholders at the table have a chance.
Yeah, could you go back to the map that shows brown? You got places in there that are 200 feet above sea level in some of those dark brown areas. Full disclosure, I was an advisor on the 2018 UW study. The mapping that came out of there is exactly what these people back here have been asking for, and it's a little more nuanced than that. I don't know what those brown areas represent. Are they census tracts?
Yeah, so the story map has, these are the census blocks.
Okay,
The census
I
block.
figured
We went to the block level. So yeah, not all the homes on there.
It may be meaningful to some people at the county, but it's not meaningful to the general public to look at the brown area that's showing areas 200 feet above sea level as being a high risk. I don't think you should use that.
The map we are using are the ones that show the communities that are on the coast. So that's what Thank you.
I think I have a question about process in terms of, I feel reluctant to ask additional questions because I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for suggestions and moving into some potential solutions and or adaptations. And in terms of time, is this block of time today the primary opportunity for the stakeholders at the table to put their voice in on these topics? Or is this just one of many conversations of this nature on this topic before the policies are finalized?
This is one of many conversations. But I think you make a good point. We kind of hit this information. We know the story map. We're going to take some of the feedback, adjust it. So kind of from the sea level rise, we're going to set that aside. And our next step really is to start talking about what your actions are. And I'm just wondering if it's a good time to transition to that and start feeding into the actions and understanding that. And we'll come back and do some updates and give some feedback to folks about what we're using the data set. So we're done with this slide. Now we're into the discussion questions. I'm going to let Susie lead that.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for your questions and your feedback. As Emily said, there is a forum online too that we are actively collecting feedback from the public all day, every day that's available. So feel free to provide us additional feedback there as well. But now we kind of want to get into a discussion session. And so as you'll see, we have sticky notes for everybody here and pens. We also have sticky notes for everybody in the audience over here as well. And what we want to hear from you is what concerns you the most pertaining to sea level rise, so we can get a good understanding of what kinds of goals and policies that we can and should develop that really will help to make Island County more resilient to some of these impending changes that we are anticipating to see. as well as we want to understand what the top priorities are. So what, from your perspective, your work, also your lived experience, is your top priorities that the goals and policies should address in this updated iteration of the climate element. So please feel free to write as many as you possibly would like. And I'm going to go around and start collecting all of the different comments and start grouping so then we can have a deeper discussion on what the suggestions are. So if everyone was to just take some time, write as many sticky notes as you can. I would say one topic per sticky note. That way we can kind of sort and organize. And then anybody who's in the audience who has any comments or priorities they'd like to share, feel free to drop CCPs here. I'll make sure everyone has enough. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, as well as providing us with all of this awesome feedback. For this portion of the workshop, we want to really focus on the individuals throughout the table who we've invited here today to have a discussion over what we're seeing here and what are the patterns. So we asked, what are the priorities and what are the concerns? So as we've sorted through the information we received, I'd say these three are the most top priority. One being residential housing. What are we going to do about the communities who have housing and property that are on shorelines who may be affected by sea level rise? We have infrastructure impacts. This includes coastal erosion, systems, water systems, transportation systems. We have concerns for aquifer, saltwater intrusion, and pressure. Next up, we have natural habitat, what is going to be the impact of sea level rise on the natural habitat. And then a few other concerns were related to data. Thank you. We received some of those verbally and written. And we will be assessing those internally as well to make sure that we are presenting the best data. Concerns over process. And then we have a few economic impact and equity. So I think it would be helpful to kind of go over each one of these and get some feedback and ideas and discussion around what the primary concerns are. So for residential housing, seems like obviously there's a ton of housing on shorelines. Is there anybody who would be interested in kind of sharing their thoughts and priorities pertaining to residential housing?
Yeah, I feel that a lot of these topics relate to economic impact and equity. And so even though they look underrepresented, I think it's because they thread through everything. And so when we think about residential housing, we think through the homeowners for whom their beachfront home is a primary residence and for whom losing that home represents a catastrophic impact. We have other homeowners for whom their beachfront property is a rental or a second or third home. Of course, also, it would be a loss if that home were inundated by floods, but potentially with a different level of impact on their lives and safety. And then we think through the people for whom beachfront property is out of reach financially, but who represent the tax base that's going to be charged with cleanup if and when these beachfront communities fail and fall into the sea. And so I just hope that when it comes to housing, we can, as a community, start to create some processes by which homeowners are encouraged to move up and back, do a planned and strategic relocation away from the shore, expand that dynamic habitat zone so that we can actually support the survival of other species like salmon and orcas, and have our homes become resilient and safe for generations to come, without necessarily holding it as a public tax burden that's going to hit us as an emergency, but instead hold it as a public responsibility that's currently with us as an opportunity to be creative and mutually interdependent.
Absolutely, I agree. And just to reiterate and confirm what you said, we want to have a more strategic approach to moving shoreline housing and residences back while also bolstering those natural systems that help to support the ecosystem function. Oh, I think this is dying, but I'll just use my voice. Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else like to share? Thank you.
I'm looking for the right time to interject this information, and I think that it would be appropriate now. The Marine Resources Committee has done a survey of shoreline armoring, and they compared armoring that existed in the last comprehensive plan cycle in 2016 and the present. And they found that there is about as much new armoring as there is restored. As we have. So it is not making progress. We are not expanding the recovery areas. And the study also compared our permits with the existing shoreline armoring observed. And they, after very careful attention, 95% of those hard armoring were installed without a permit. So as we talk about housing, I think we really need to also figure out ways to look at how to work collaboratively with the owners of property to establishing an understanding and also cooperation with the guidelines and
Wholeheartedly agree, and that's something we've been discussing internally, but I do like that comment about ensuring we're collaborating with these homeowners, making sure that permits are getting done.
Yeah, and I think upfront transparency of risk and assumption of risk for those who choose to build in areas that we know.
Yes.
I think would be really important. Also, for what Marty mentioned about tax base, assuming the risk for this individual that, I mean, we do it for other things like if they're in a flight path, they know that they're moving into a place where it's going to be noisy. If you're building into an area that's projected to be in this, that should be a very clear assumption of risk on the part of the purchaser, that I think could relieve others from absorbing that choice. The second is around saltwater intrusion. As you know, the vast majority of us are on wells, water wells, with the exception of Oak Harbor, bringing it in. It's not just about the number of water columns and water wells that are impacted by saltwater intrusion, but the added pressure it adds to moving those wells elsewhere and we're drawing off of others. So we have these stacking functions of increasing pressure. I know under one of the other work groups we'll be talking about our recharge rate going down and our demand going up. This is another one of those things that adds pressure, particularly to farmers who rely heavily on water and often become the first targets of restriction. So we should be thinking ahead of that growing food is still given a priority, particularly on an island where it serves as what a lot of people think is an emergency preparedness to be able to grow food. So I think thinking through that now will save us a lot of heartache on the backside.
Yes.
Much easier to think through water problems before wells.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that definitely kind of gets in some of this economic impact and equity impact as well. Like how are these policies impacting farmers and landowners, right? That's a really great comment. Here.
Yeah, focusing on the residential aspect of it, I guess for a moment, I live fairly close to one of the most at-risk shoreline communities. There's a lot of fear and a lot of denial about sea level rise and the impending damage. People kind of avoid talking about it except when they have to, like the 2022 storm surge event. Sometimes, to do the things that you're talking about there, such as encouraging people to move back, houses on stilts, so on and so forth. At some point, we need to start a dialogue. And right now, there's kind of a standoff, and that dialogue isn't happening. It needs to between not just the homeowners and say the county, but all the other people that have an interest in the beach. We'll get onto it when we talk about natural habitat and other things, but our concern is that natural habitat just gets squeezed out here. And by the time we actually start talking to people and taking some of those measures, the beach has already gone by then. And we're left with a wharf anyway. So yeah, starting to figure out a roadmap, engaging in the conversation, getting these options on the table and asking these people how they see the future of their property when sea level rises 3 feet high. What do they want to see happen? Now that they know that children maybe aren't going to inherit it after all, it's not going to be the family beach cabin for another 100 years. We need to start talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think educational component is huge and collaboration as well, as said before.
So almost all three comments, a couple of things that I think are add-ons. You started talking about essentially the economics of the tax basis. And one of the things you have to think about is if you lose that structure, you've also lost at the tax basis associated with that property value. Because the property has a value, the structure has another value. So that's something that needs to be thought about in terms of how it then affects infrastructure and other things.
Absolutely, financial level, risk.
Right? Which to some extent in your roadmap, I saw some data towards that. You were using the values of parcels and things of that nature at a high level. And I'm sure that drills down. Second is that kind of coupling along with this gentleman's conversation, if you think about existing homes and desiring to be proactive and move towards how can you stay ahead of that curve, right? Much like there are several other things, I think it addresses the bulkhead issue. I mean, there are roadblocks currently at the permitting level that force people to step around it, force people to not follow through with the proper procedures associated with that. And so I would say, a goal needs to be to ensure that we have the ability to be transparent and upfront and understand that bulkhead needs to be repaired in the next 2 weeks, not in 270 days down the road when we decide to come up with a permit that says it can happen. Or if you think about existing structures, helping people understand how can you improve it and make it ready for a situation. So again, that goes back to helping with influencing of permitting and things of that nature, where you're saying, I want to raise the house, for instance. Is that, if you're being proactive, should that be as burdensome as trying to develop a brand new piece of property, right?
Right.
Where you need to take into consideration natural habitat, and the list goes on and on. So I would think that when you start talking about equity, those are the kinds of things that I see play into that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Making things a little easier to access and not so burdensome. And I will say we are focusing this portion of the discussion just for the near future, just on the participants here, but we will open to the audience again as we have time, but we just want to make sure we get the information. We can't have enough time.
I wanted to note also, although agriculture is a big, I wanted to note the businesses in aquaculture that aren't at the table, namely Pinko Mussels, these folks whose business model is very related to this topic. So I want to make sure their input is sought, even in separate conversations, because their entire business models will be affected by this. And then one other comment on, it really relates to infrastructure and natural habitat, is introducing the term natural infrastructure. So the one analogy I will draw from Florida is the reduction of wetlands and the impact on king tides and stuff. So looking at some of these natural infrastructure features as more than just the warm, fuzzy ecological value, but also the protective and financial function that they play, and assigning incentives to ensure that those are kept in place for their benefits.
Yeah, education on the benefits and making sure the policies are protecting those and people are aware of what the benefits are, right? Not this, like you said, I like the fuzzy kind of, oh, we like our natural landscape, but those are actual services that are being provided to us.
I would like to interject a challenge. It seems to me that the potential for housing to be the primary driver of the economic planning is there are going to be some changes no matter what. And San Juan County does have an excise tax which supports restoration of their shoreline, and it's paid for by individuals who are buying. And it is lovely to see the real estate community very supportive of this because it enhances property values. They have green spaces around. And I would like to just challenge a paradigm shift that there are ways to be successful with an economic development plan that includes the flood-prone areas in new ways to use them. Recreation, public access, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
A refuge, a haven in this spreading urban sprawl.
Yes, I love that. I love that idea and that example. That's really, really important to consider as well. We talk about the challenges, but there are also opportunities.
There really are, and San Juan is kind of in this proven.
Right.
I also just want to mention how important the term best available science is, how often we look to that term in our policies and our laws. A lot of things say that decisions need to be based upon best available science. But I would charge Island County with really getting clear on where we get our data and how proactive we are about gathering it, using it, interpreting it, and applying it. And so, for instance, for a topic like bulkheads, it's a very emotionally charged topic, and people, in my experience, tend to be dug in on one side or the other of this question around whether more bulkheads should be permitted or whether more bulkheads should be removed and the shore restored for habitat. And I think that there's definitely a need for people to have a place to express their feelings. There's a need for people to deal with the grief, with the hope, with the longing, with the anger, all the things. But beyond feelings, bulkheads function in certain ways, and science can show us what those ways are, and sometimes those ways are not the desired outcome. So, for instance, you may get seawater inundation of a septic system under a bulkhead, or water captured behind a bulkhead after a king tide. You may also see deflection of wave action onto adjoining bluffs and erosion of bluffs and worsening of conditions adjacent to the protected property. So an assumption that we need to choose between, pro bulkhead or an anti-bulkhead stance is overly black and white. And I feel like we need to create space, as Mr. Levy pointed to, for the dialogue and the discourse, so that people can feel heard and understood. We also need to create really clear pathways for getting the best available science into the hands of the decision makers and educate the public about what that process looks like and how it's implemented. Because I feel right now we have a lot of people acting from feeling or alliances or relational capital, and we need some decision making that's rooted in understanding our community's needs and feelings, and then acting from something basic fact.
Absolutely. I think we're hearing a lot of needing to collaborate here today and navigate those conversations that these are people's lives, right? They have their property is in their hands or their value. I mean, it's their homes. So I wholeheartedly agree. And it seems like we've had a couple comments about collaboration and also education, making sure that people who are impacted by these things are properly educated. And there's a space for that anger, that grief, or that frustration, while also making sure that we are kind of operating from a stance of this is what's coming, this is kind of what we know is coming based on the information we have available, and sharing that, having that dialogue be back and forth. I'll go right here.
Yeah, I just want to kind of continue the thought there in a way. Talk a little bit about why we see so much primacy of residential housing in these conversations. I mentioned, I think I was on that an advisory team for Ian Miller's project in 2018, the UW project. And what the team was hoping to do was take a look at, on a parcel scale throughout the Sound, at the vulnerability of not just residential housing, another real estate, if you will, but also public infrastructure such as roads, sewers, septic systems, water lines, and so on and so forth. Other things like boat ramps, beaches, public beach access, parks, and so on that use the shoreline, but also the natural habitat.
Yeah.
And we were unable to find a sound-wide data set that actually measures those things. So what we can measure is property values, and that's also what we can tax. So if we're not careful, that winds up being the thing that we care about. We wind up caring about what we can measure rather than trying to measure what we care about. And there's a trade-off here always. If you do some of these things, bulkheads, there's going to be some losses associated with that. You're going to lose some beach. What's the dollar value of that? I mean, what's the value of that to Island County, to have that beach as a resource for us all, including those who don't live on the shoreline? No point having a beach there if the owners are in Bellevue, you know, and the sprinkler systems are, and the no trespassing signs up. I mean, it doesn't help us here. So we need to quantify those things.
Yes.
And that's one action that we could certainly take, is to try to quantify some of those other factors that need to come into consideration when we're making these decisions.
Absolutely.
So that it becomes, as Jackson there says, not just a pro for on bulkheads, but, you know, a rational discussion about whether or not it makes economic sense to do that versus some potential alternatives. And right now we're missing half of that.
Yes, and that's really the kind of biggest challenge in our work, is having access to data, but maybe there's also a opportunity to measure some of these things that are more aligned with our goals.
David Trimble, the Puget Sound Partnership, has a study that was done about the sense of place here in Island County and the importance of this.
Absolutely.
So with regards to keeping that conduit of latest science and accurate information open, I think that all counties, but I'll say particularly this county, can sometimes be challenged with insular information. And it's not fair to the staff that gets, the hydrologist that gets pulled up to answer questions about climate modeling. That's not in his purview. But that's often what happens. And I don't know that that's beneficial to anyone, and not fair to staff, I'd say also. So developing some mechanisms that allow decision makers and policymakers, access to, whether it's a UW climate group, some group that's operating with the latest science that can articulate real numbers and answer questions, so that these staff can focus on more of the triage response that they're geared to do. Second comment is about something that doesn't, maybe from the agricultural perspective, is we have a very fragile topsoil layer here, very fragile. And whether it's a king tide, flooding, or I'm trying to keep it focused on sea level rise, but it bleeds over to acute rain events and more flooding events. The preservation and identification of prime topsoil areas should be emphasized. It takes about 700 years to develop an inch of topsoil naturally, and it can be lost like that. So we want to preserve what we've got.
Absolutely. And, I think often these climate hazards are really have compounding effects. So definitely welcome the comment that also integrates some like changing precipitation patterns and other things too. So very helpful and useful. We've kind of jumped around a bit. So maybe, I feel like we haven't maybe covered in these comments some of these aquifer comments, but curious if we could shift the conversation to talk about concerns with aquifer and if there are any comments.
The aquifer question is really critical. And just for the record, there's more than one pocket of fresh water that's tapped. A single source reflects that we depend upon it. And there's no back. And the numbers that were used in some planning meetings indicated that available or ungiven connections to water systems would be indicated as surplus water, water ready to be used for new residents. It is very important to maintain the water pressure in our wells so that seawater intrusion does not get occur. And once contaminated, there are others, there are experts in the room, but once contaminated, a well cannot. And 70% of the population of this county relies upon wells. And this is
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're one of, I think, 5 federally designated sole source aquifer areas in the state. And I think that needs to be given special emphasis, mainly for the fact that we currently don't have a plan B. So whereas normally you might measure it with some risk, so we'll figure it out when we get there. Right now, you know, I'm speaking as a farmer, we're done when the well goes dry. So,
Yeah.
And this notion that it is just this, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the aquifer recharges across the island. In fact, most of the modeling we're being presented, most of the assumptions made are based on historical weather patterns, historical precipitation models. We've done 0 changes to looking at our recharge rate change. That's a huge problem. And the last thorough study of our aquifer is 30 years old.
So we definitely need an updated one.
Yes, and it shouldn't be something that is put on the county hydrologist to generate. These are big undertakings.
Right.
And I think fundamental to this understanding is what is our recharge situation right now, given these changes we're observing, given what we're being modeled, and how should we be preparing? We should be approaching it just like we would a hurricane off the coast. We use the best information we got and try to prepare. None of this is Chicken Little. None of this is overreaction. But to not do that now is to push the risk at a greater degree to be handled when it is.
And especially for a critical asset like water.
It's our well.
Right.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add on to what was just shared, 2 really important opportunities will be in front of Island County tomorrow as they solidify their 2025 work plan. I'm told by county commissioners that 2 priority issue areas for local climate and environmental community members, one being the consideration of creating a critical drainage area for all of Island County that would hold people to a certain standard of ensuring that rainfall that falls on down sinks into the islands versus being channeled as stormwater, which then increases erosion, depletes topsoil, pollutes the sound. So I've asked our commissioners to consider, or not just to consider, but to act upon putting that critical drainage area proposal, which was drafted by a really well-informed gentleman in our community named Mr. Haas. I want and expect that that should be on the work plan for the year to come because it's been in discussion by department level directors and it seems like a viable proposal. Number 2 being that our public benefit rating system, which is a land taxation program that gives people some incentive to protect land that serves the public benefit, that program really needs to be overhauled and reconsidered to take into account things like the aquifer recharge benefit of protected forest, to give farmers and landowners and forest owners an off-ramp from continuing to work non-viable land that is subject to tidal inundation, for instance, to give people who own a forest a choice between using it for timber harvest or using it for the public benefit of aquifer recharge. So looking at how to make that PBRS program more welcoming, more inclusive, more incentivizing could have big rewards for our recharge capacity. That's also going to be up for discussion for inclusion on the 2025 work plan. And I think, to use the hurricane analogy, when you know there's a hurricane offshore and you know it's coming and you don't know quite how hard it'll hit, you do batten down the hatches. You do make sure that your fastens, that your roof is screwed on with 6-inch bolts, not 1-inch bolts. And so we have this opportunity now to say we protect our forest, we protect our rainfall, we keep our water on our island to the best of our ability and get it into the aquifer. And yeah, we need to understand more. We need to do the research to bring our hydrogeological modeling up to date. We need to understand the projected precipitation and how rainfall events are likely to be more rare and more heavy. But in the meantime, we can protect what we have by adding these two things to the work plans. I would encourage anybody who's concerned about these issues to reach out to the county commissioners in advance of tomorrow's meeting or during tomorrow's meeting to just say, let's make sure these things get the attention of commissioners and staff in 2025.
Absolutely. And I think that's like a both and, right? We know what kinds of interventions help to increase aquifer recharge. So let's do those things now and update the information and science that we have to be more up to date so we know what to expect into the future. Any other comments on aquifer? I'm sure we will also cover that more in depth with the changing precipitation as well, but looks like you.
On the infrastructure, I just wanted to point out that many of our shoreline communities have a braided assembly of privately owned water systems and publicly owned responsibilities, and private industry is there. And if there is an emergency, the question of who's responsible for what becomes very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And the septic fields that get flooded actually end up, all of these things in emergencies are complicated.
Yes.
Because a privately owned septic drain field may be the only way for a rescue staff to get access to a house, and they're having to go through a mess. So I would just say the role of government is not clear, and it needs to be very clear what is the county's business and what is the private citizen's responsibility. And we need to do a work plan that makes it clear before the hurricane.
Absolutely, especially in the event of something happens, and everything's sheer chaos, to have like a plan of who's in charge of what.
Yeah, there needs to be some malleability built into this sacred work plan because of the aforementioned scenarios. I understand the need for a work plan, but I also want to emphasize that sometimes we're going to need to call an audible, and staff's going to have to shift and work on things related to this arena. So to the extent we can build that into this now, I think we need to move away from the rigidity of not the plan, I'm not working on it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And, related to the work plan and staff capacity to take on essential arising issues when they already have existing essential issues, I think that there is a sort of a scarcity mindset in Island County around having enough people to do the work. And it's hard for everybody. Nobody has, I should say, not very many of us have more than enough resources to do everything we'd like to do. Island County doesn't have more than enough resources to do everything it would like to do. And as we're discussing, we're going to see some implications in our tax base as we lose shoreline property. But I do think that we could get more creative about partnerships. We could get more creative about public-private partnerships. We could get more creative about seeking grant funding with state and tribal and federal partners to do some of these ambitious restoration projects. How exciting would it be to take something like Deer Lagoon or the Max Walton watershed and say, how do we create a climate resilient habitat area that's good for planet and people in partnership with jurisdictions and agencies that have funding? And I just think this sort of scarcity of we don't have enough time, we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough money. If we dream big enough into what's possible, we might find unexpected opportunity.
Absolutely. I love the conversation about opportunity, because sometimes this work can be filled with doom and gloom, but it's very true. I mean, we can put our minds together and create really collaborative partnerships to really dream big and do some really interesting things with our changing climate that we're seeing. Any other, yes, go ahead.
Is there anybody in the room from Public Works from Island Town? My experience working in small government is there's a lot of departments that work in silos. And I don't know if this is the case in Island County. Langley is starting to see a shift in how we work together. Planning oftentimes is very far out in front of what Public Works is able to actually implement in the field. So the question of infrastructure and aquifer and data, I'm just wondering if some sort of culture shift is needed in local government to improve the way that departments are working together and making sure that projects are aligning with the goals that are being done. And oftentimes Public Works is years behind implementing the action that planning has identified as necessary. So as we're moving forward with goals and ideas, it's really important to get the buy-in from the people who are going out for the grants and going out for the money that are actually implementing the things that are on a big scale important to the community and making big differences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think coupled with both of what you said there, my experience has been as a private contractor, if you will, that you're exactly correct. It has to be a priority of the commissioners within what we're talking about here, but the ability to actually fund the staff to move through the process and implement it and then regulate it. Because that's where we find the issue is, they can all do their job, but they're all working at 100%, and there's no way they're ever going to catch up to the file cabinet that continues to be longer and longer and longer. And there's been this, I think you said it, I think there's a cultural feel that we're doing good enough, and good enough is not good enough. It will never get us to where we want to go. And you can take either side, right? I empathize with the farmer because I have a very small farm myself, and everything he says, I'm like, yep, right? I empathize with how we can try to work through problems with existing housing stock, because an existing house means we're not taking natural resources to build a new one, yet it's in a location that currently we know that Sunlight Beach is potentially going to get flooded in a good king tide, right? Or Saratoga or wherever. And so that to me then goes back to the governmental agencies that are regulating that, having the ability to actually, once goals are set, once policy is put into position, to then have the ability to carry that out. And I've watched that over 30 years worth of building of talking about something, but just never getting that. So I think we could have already been doing something, and yet we don't ever get there. So, if I had to say a goal needs to be to find the funding mechanism that allows for the ability to have a hydrologist on staff full-time, right? Or any other of these pieces that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
One way to potentially address that, and I know some communities in the area have done it, I think Bainbridge and some other counties, with the disclaimer that that person is given the authority and inter silo ability to move things forward. Sometimes a liaison or an ombudsman designated to these issues with department director level access, which it has to have that, otherwise it would become its own, is something we might want to look at that would help relieve the staff planning for the departments, because it would be freed up in this FTE. It may pay for itself in spades. And we can look to other communities for that. So that also dovetails into us not reinventing the wheel, to look to a lot of the surrounding communities that have addressed a lot of these issues with some really clever solutions. And I want to make sure we don't leave those on the table. We should steal a lot of those.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
I love that. Early on, at the very outset of this meeting, I heard you say, and I think I have your name written down here somewhere.
John.
John, you said there's no roadmap on how to do this, and I wrote, but are there jurisdictions doing good work already? So I would love to follow Jake's suggestion and look for great examples from around the region.
Absolutely. None of this is gonna happen in a vacuum. None of it is. It's also intertwined and very deeply so. So there's roadblocks at every turn, so it's really identifying where and how to identify the roadmap, or, you know, the roadblocks, and then how to navigate within, you know, between planning and between public works, and, you know, to get around those very, very big, you know, no's and many yeses.
Just a clarification, not a roadmap to do a climate element.
Right.
100% agree with the observation that there are people out there doing different and good things with climate work.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be under a climate element, but yeah, climate element.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I feel like a common theme I'm hearing is just a lot of coordination, not only interdepartmental coordination from an internal standpoint, but also coordination with residents and people in the community, as well as strategic partnerships with maybe other local governments, and just sharing context, sharing ideas, sharing any kind of clever and strategic solutions that can also be brought in and implemented here as well. I think that's definitely really important.
I would also add, just to the point of culture, do the staff of our jurisdictions feel like they have the bandwidth and the psychological safety to really name what's working and what's not working? Because I see really good people working their butts off in a system where it's hard to move the important things forward. And I can imagine that it would be dispiriting to be told again and again that the important stuff isn't moving forward. And especially because I see the volume of work product that our county staff is producing, and it's impressive, it's a lot. And they're, you know, generally people who are called to do this work because they care. And so I guess I would just ask, you know, when we think about culture, when we think about this comprehensive plan, how do we hold our county accountable to take really good care of the people that are doing the work, so that we don't keep losing staff, so that our attrition can slow down, our turnover can slow down, and we can start to retain wisdom and expertise and institutional memory? And then how do we solve the financial riddle of how to have enough people to do the work so that we're not burning people out?
Absolutely.
And we need a commitment, and I think that there's a resolution that says that. We need a commitment from the executives, from leadership, that implementation of this work is going to be a priority. A lot of the things that have been brought up are in the 2016 comp plan and still haven't been implemented. So we need assurance that we're not going to be in the same boat the 2016 comp plan is in, sitting on a table unimplemented. So implementation is important. We're investing so much resources in this that we can't have a repeat where good ideas get left like dust, and that starts at the elected level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, your comment about silos triggered something there. I do a lot of work at the state level as well with state government, state agencies, and that's a major problem at the state level. Between ecology, fish and wildlife, and then if we're dealing with shoreline issues, Army Corps of Engineers gets involved, and so on and so forth. Different, even within agencies, some worse than others, you have that siloing issue. But compounding all of that, in the case of this issue, talking about climate change, is that we have no soundbite philosophy. It's like every county for itself. California has a coastal commission from, you know, the Mexican border to that takes care of coordinating shoreline issues and policies throughout the state. We have nothing like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, Island County's at the sharp end. According to that study that I keep mentioning, 50% of the most at-risk parcels in Island County are, in the Sound, are in Island County, half of them. And we don't have the money that King County does to handle some of those things. So the state could be doing more here in terms of setting a climate philosophy, climate change philosophy. You know, some of the things that have been done are great, but dealing with sea level rise, dealing with the actual consequences of it, we're still all out here on our own trying to figure this out at the county level, which is not a reasonable way to go about it. We don't have the funding, we don't have the staff. We need more support from the state level on that. So that I think is something that needs to be shouted from the rooftops.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
Christina, have you haven't had a chance?
Thank you. No, I'm good. All of this, the sentiment that everybody else is expressing is all of this is so intertwined, and obviously what the economic impacts are in addition to all the other impacts that the result of sea level rise. I don't really have any questions or anything to add that anybody else hasn't said already.
All right. Well, it seems like we've covered residential housing quite a bit, aquifer. We've touched on infrastructure. Not sure if there are any other additional comments that want to be made about infrastructure that haven't been made yet.
I would just love to see the county continue to work for septic alternatives in our urban growth areas and in our NMUGAs, because until we have adequate sanitation in Freeland and Clinton, we really can't put housing density where it's appropriate to put housing density on the south end. And we need something other than individual septic systems for a lot of these communities, especially as we have fewer and fewer lots that perk. And I would really love to understand what beachfront communities' off-site septic alternative picture looks like if we lose the septic systems before we lose the homes. What's our planned retreat for sewage treatment infrastructure on our lowest lying communities? And how is that a community effort rather than an individual family by family effort to maximize resilience and minimize cost and contamination?
Absolutely. Definitely like a much larger plan to transition away from septic systems, especially in more urbanized areas. Any other comments about wastewater infrastructure?
I really liked the idea that was brought up about a reasonable fund that's maybe part of newcomers' purchase price absorbing some risk. That maybe paired with other resources serves as a buffer to unforeseen impact that can throw off our budgets immediately. Building in buffers financially out of the gates and thinking sensibly about this up front while we're talking about this in a proactive posture. We'll be on our toes and our heels. We're on our toes right now. We can build in funds to deal with things rather than end up in a deficit and a plan for the unforeseen.
Definitely. Absolutely. Kind of a risk assessment strategy to our finances and making sure that we are planning for any kind of climate impacts or associated compounding hazards and make sure that doesn't hit us and drain. Any other comments? Infrastructure, housing. Yeah, we've discussed natural habitat quite a bit as well, but are there any other remaining comments for natural habitat?
I would just ask that it not be a second thought or treated as less than the human housing and infrastructure needs, because as Jake mentioned, it is the vital underpinnings of everything we have and do.
Absolutely.
And additionally, if we look at the goals set by the state around why we need a climate resilience sub-element, they relate to addressing natural hazards. Those hazards would be to people as well as to non-human life. Addressing, identifying, protecting, and enhancing natural areas and vital habitat. And then community resilience and adaptation that's consistent with environmental justice. And when we think about environmental justice, oftentimes it's the people furthest from economic access that have the least ability to live in healthy, safe spaces with functional ecosystems. And so if we were to start with natural habitat as the foundation of everything we have and do and are, and say, how do we maximize the well-being of our ecosystems, our natural spaces, the wetlands of today and tomorrow, And then from there, what does community resilience in that context look like? I think it would be a really different conversation than if we start from how do we change our human habitation and prepare for calamity, and then what's left as open space. So we can look right now at these maps, and instead of seeing a map that shows devastation and homes lost, what we need to see that, of course, we need to be prepared for that. But what we can also see is, wow, that will be a tidal estuary. What is going to live there? Who's going to migrate to there? What species will feed on the fish that swim there? What does that mean for the salmon? What does that mean for the southern resident orcas? And we can start to become prepared to welcome that biodiversity, to create space for that biodiversity, if we see it not just as a risk, but also as an opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's definitely important to kind of contextualize ourselves in our environment as well. We live on this land and we extract resources, so it's just as important. It's not outside, it's ingrained.
Great. The other thing to be mindful of is that it's not a whim, it's not a courtesy. There is a federal structure that has entrusted to us the stewardship of our natural habitat, the shoreline, and the treaty obligations that we have that are taken very seriously in this state require that we maintain the natural environment intact in such a way that those treaty obligations can be met. So I just want a little footnote that says it's more than simply treaty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think
Absolutely.
lexicon can matter. So it relates particularly to economic analysis and impact analysis, even using the term natural infrastructure as it relates to what you say ecosystem services. If it's providing a function that buffers something that we'd have to otherwise build, that should be built in to the value in the way we view it. And I think the way we frame it and discuss it and the words we use matter a lot in how people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess I did mention somewhere earlier that, that we're lacking a way to properly value natural habitat in a way that stacks up against say, residential housing. And while by doing some of these things, looking at infrastructure services and so on, and other stuff too. I mean, that you can develop something, but it may never be equal in strictly financial terms. But there's so many other qualitative benefits that come from some of these natural elements. As Barbara mentioned, a paper by David Trimber, G and I have to be co-authors on it, that talked about the sense of place in island counties being important, and access to the shoreline and enjoying the shoreline was a huge part of that. So if in maintaining a beachfront property, you destroy the beach that you came there to enjoy, not just for yourself, but for everybody else, even if you can't put a dollar value on that beach, you've still lost it.
Absolutely.
And we need to frame the conversation in such a way that all of those things can be factored in. That stakeholders represent all of those sides of it, including stakeholders. We can't obviously invite the orcas to come talk themselves, but we can. Would be great. But we, they need to be represented in that conversation too, and not with the intention of trying to figure out who's going to be a winner, but to try and make sure we all, build this place and maintain this place.
Absolutely. And I think that gets kind of down to your previous comment too about, how are we measuring these things and what is important? And there's a lot of qualitative information and sense of place and belonging that needs to be at the table. That's also really important. And how do we, in some ways, kind of measure that to just help inform our goals and decisions?
Yeah, we wind up, if we only, if we keep looking at what we can measure, we wind up only caring about what we can measure instead of trying to measure.
Exactly. Beautifully said. Right. Well.
Did you get my project on?
Absolutely.
Because I from the beginning, there's a movement afoot to say we have to write goals and policies that can be measured. Then it was echoed at the planning commission. We briefed them on the climate element a few months ago. So one of the things I'd love for this group to think about is, as we think about these actions, what are the ways to measure those actions and what would measure a positive trend for that action, or better yet, even a success for that action? How do we measure it? How do we kind of guide those policies so it's measurable, so we can come back in 8 years and say, okay, what have we done and what have we haven't done, and how much more do we have to do? And I will say that the Puget Sound Climate Collaborative, which is a large group here in Puget Sound, just got a grant from NOAA to start measuring coastal resilience. Now, that's it. That's the grant. Now, the details of that are yet to be figured out, but there's some money in there to figure that out. And that's going to be available to all the counties, all 12 counties that border Puget Sound, except for our neighbors to the north, the Canadians. They are part of it. But, you know, you got to think about that too. The sound is more than just what we see up until we get to the San Juan counties. We also have to think about what's going on north of the border. And I'd say that those folks have the same inclinations as well. But we want to think about measuring. We want to think about measuring these goals and policies so we can come back in 4 to 5 years and say, where are we on this spectrum? Right? We want to be able to measure that. So think about those things as well. I mean, you said it, you brought it up, the measure. How do we measure? You know, how do we measure these? If we don't have a measurement for it. That's something we can help.
And to that point, I would encourage decision makers in Island County to budget now for that follow-up, because all too often we see really good policies being adopted and then totally unenforced, totally unmeasured, totally unexamined. And so what we would like to be able to predict is how do we as a county come together and understand the impact of our decisions today on the community of 5 years, 10 years from now. And so some kind of mechanism to bring you back or have somebody do that kind of analysis of where we're at with our key performance indicators 5 and 10 and 15 years down the road. I would just love to see there be some foresight about planning for that, to resource that work.
What we built into the SEDS was exactly that, monitoring for that purpose to ensure that the plans.
Great.
Just to the idea of a bigger tent makes more sense as far as making sure stakeholders that may not even know they're affected are included in the discussion. I think that when we're talking about fisheries and fishermen and all of these folks that may not be at the table today that are certainly affected by this, we may need to expand what we view as economic impacts. Ecotourism, agritourism, all of these things maybe fall outside of the immediate measurable, what we define as a measurable circle. They need to be expanded because of the ripples it has across the board.
Absolutely, definitely being inclusive to everyone who will be impacted in the different kinds of businesses or kind of ecotourism you mentioned as well. Really important. All right.
Not to mention the physical and mental health impacts of ecological degradation versus ecological restoration, and the cost to public health and well-being of living in an increasingly compromised environment versus the health benefits of becoming an oasis of green in Puget Sound for residents and visitors alike.
Absolutely. I think this goes into like the measuring of the benefit and how we're calculating that. That's not just dollars, right? That's lived experience and sense of place and how people orient to their environment. And that, although there's no dollar price you can put on that, that is a net benefit.
The last point I wanted to make was about a term that I think resonates with people who may not typically want to be involved in this conversation, and that's emergency preparedness, particularly as an island. All of the things that are going to be involved in these elements bleed seamlessly or dovetail into emergency response and preparedness. And I think that in that context, we loop in a lot of people that might otherwise not be interested in the conversation. So it's just something to, I think, address directly.
Absolutely. I think, especially in doing this kind of work, we've all kind of starting to live through some of the changes. So we're seeing different kinds of disasters happening in other places, locally as well, and that's definitely a point of concern for most residents. All right. Well, I think we've covered most of our topics, and I'm kind of curious if there are any other comments from the audience for the last about 20 minutes or so. If there are any additions from those who are, hello.
A small handful of us here that live on the beach. And I guess we're very surprised that we're not considered stakeholders in this. There's nobody that has more to lose than those of us who are full-timers on the beach. And we haven't had any kind of say in this.
That's a great comment, and I think we are structuring different kinds of outreach for different groups and different folks, so there will definitely be opportunity for different groups to participate, but I think that's definitely really important to note that our shoreline residential communities are definitely, specifically in this context, have the most to lose, so how we're going to make sure we're integrating them in the future is really important.
Well, can't we make sure that any comments that are make it into this now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Apologize for being late, not recognizing the difference here. So, as a property, what you just said, I've been involved with trying to protect shoreline property. There seems to be a very adversarial position between government. And I just want to put out, I consider myself, and a lot of my preferences are aligned, but I would ask that people check their assumptions. Somebody mentioned moving your property back. A lot of us can't move our property. Somebody mentioned putting no trespassing sign on the beach. We own the beach, and we don't put no trespassing sign on the beach. So I would ask that assumptions really be checked. We try to work together on this stuff because, people see owners being rich. Well, if property values keep going up, you use your property, yes, you've got valuable assets. But suddenly you can't use them and you're paying taxes. They're not an asset, they're a liability.
Yeah.
So let's try and be on the same page here.
I think it's super important, your comments. Were there any ideas that weren't hit or ideas that were missed that you guys think should be added to? I think your voice is important. And I'm wondering if along these topics, if there's anything specific else saw that was missed or that should be added so that it makes it into the record and gets addressed.
Well, I would just like to say that our full-time home is here, has been for 25 years. We're on Mutiny Bay. We too have been trying to get shoreline stabilization to protect our places for a couple of years. But it's really absurd to think that you can move more. There's no place for these houses to go. That's just not a concept that's a possibility. So, it might sound nice and I'll put them up on stilts, but again, these things aren't practical. You can never get a building permit to do them. In my particular case, we have about a 200-foot hill directly behind our house where the road is. If we put our house up on something, it would just wash the hillside down. So these generalizations are really complicated, and things need to be looked at specifically.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to note here as well. And that as we are sharing ideas, some of these ideas are really not practical at all. And
Jane, as an observer and planning commissioner, I would like to see us create goals and policies that talk about internet solutions
Yes.
not the 50-year out.
Mm-hmm.
And we need the 50-year out vision and goals for that. But in the meantime, what are we going to do for the next 10 years?
Yeah.
And so I would ask county, let's talk about, and parametrics, let's talk about interim solutions that maybe work someplace else. And then we can do those now to the grandfathered residents. We can consider the San Juan approach of any new development. We don't want to jeopardize anything long-term from our natural resources. But we don't want to also open the eyes of people who love the beach.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the things I think we're missing.
So I think that you keyed in on the historic waterfront and the canals. And I can't tell you exactly, I know the county map pretty well, but there are a number of locations, and your comment just made me think of this, where you do have homes that are right along the beach. There is a road directly behind them, and then there is a 200-foot, for all intents and manners, a bluff directly behind it. So, number one, there is no moving of anything, and that's why my comment is, as a builder, trying to find ways to work through things where there's always going to be adversity, right? So the adversity is, number one, if you happen to have a home that was built in the early 40s, Brighton Beach is a perfect example. You are going to get flooded every single time there's a king tide, right? So how do we go about a permitting process? How do we go about a process where, unlike, and I'm very familiar with dealing with bulkheads and running up against red tape constantly, where there are processes that allow for something to happen right now because you have to be able to not allow that home, for instance, to be inundated and an after the fact permitting system. But instead of thinking that's sort of a Band-Aid, if you will, instead of that, thinking in a long-term approach of how can we make this through education, through policy, an avenue for one to say, I want to protect the family home, because that's the other thing, is an awful lot of waterfront has been passed down generation after generation. I don't particularly live on the waterfront, but my family has waterfront property. It was a historic fishing village where people came in the 40s and stayed in cabins and launched their boats and all those things. So they're still dealing with exactly what we're talking about. And so I really think it's important to think long-term in abilities that would allow for those properties to have processes that would allow them to adapt to what we're talking about, sea level rise. And I've worked enough situations on waterfront where we're dealing with the natural habitat. We're dealing with wetlands. I have multiple projects right now that it's not just the shoreline. I also have a natural wetland in between that. So you have buffers and you have, it goes on and on and on. As long as there's a process that can be attained, an owner can decide whether that makes sense or not. When there's not, and you find yourself, as you said, a lot of things we're talking about, they all exist, but implementation of them is a completely different conversation than let's set a goal.
Yeah.
So I didn't really know why I was here, to be completely honest, other than Emily said I would like you to come. And the more I sit and listen, I think, okay, yep. More than 70% of what I build is high bank waterfront, on the water, and so I'm dealing with all of these parts and pieces. And you talk about a typical building permit, it's a year to a year and a half, as long as we're not dealing with the Army Corps of Engineers. I laughed at your comment. I have a particular case that it's not the county that's holding us up. It is 3 different state entities, and they just do this. So.
Thank you so much for your comments, and for kind of seeing things differently. I'm doing the same thing, and this is a healthy discussion. My fear is that we are assuming that development is a given. And we have islands that have finite resources. So there's a disconnect there. And,
Well, to that point, I think that that's an important piece of why you should look at existing housing stock as opposed to new housing stock. So all the infrastructure for the most part is already in place for an existing. Septic systems may be an issue. The whole Freeland, that makes so much sense. It's unbelievable. Follows Growth Management Act to a T, but without an actual sewer system, we're stuck, right? So that says that on your lot and on your lot and your lot, we're going to build single houses and we're going to have to find water somewhere and so on. So if you walk along Front Street, I have completely remodeled 4 of those buildings. 3 of them are over water. Never want to do it again. It's horrible, right? But they're all over 100 years old and have been redone to the point that I'm sure that they will last at least another 100 years without having to create or use a new piece of land. So, I think that we didn't really talk about that as a goal because my intent was not to be Mr. Builder, but I think it falls in line with the residential housing piece. It falls in line with infrastructure. Certainly water and natural habitat are all intertwined to that. So that piece is a critical element. And that's the way I see it. And so I was honestly trying to give this gentleman back there, who I do believe he agree. I agree. I'm not sure what the number of units are that are on the waterfront because I couldn't attain that out of the mapping, but just as much time as I spend in the GIS, there's a lot.
Well, I think it brings up really, and this conversation is helpful in the sense that I think part of the reason it gets, I don't think there's probably more agreement what I'm hearing than there is camps of disagreement with what you guys said. But I think it would be helpful to bifurcate the discussion at the county level between existing homeowners that are in a situation and have legacy homes and this sort of thing, and new building, because we tend to blend these conversations together and it gets messy and murky. And I'm not prescribing an outcome, but I think the conversation would be better handled in camps. So maybe that's not camps, but by demo of what there's by circumstance. And maybe that's happening, but at least from the outside, it seems to be handled as one big doughy, foggy mess.
Yeah, there's an aspect to this that we didn't touch on yet, which is something called shoreline gentrification, which is what we're seeing going on. And it's what I seem to see going on. Maybe you see it as a builder or not, but I see, folks like these gentlemen behind me here who've had these places in their family for years who don't put no trespass signs up, share the beach with other people, ultimately getting priced out because 10 out of 10 homes on Sunlight Beach, for example, are now listed. All of the homes that are now listed 10 out of 10 for flood factor. Zillow's picking it up now as well. They're almost uninsurable. And what happens is they get torn down and somebody builds a 6,000 foot mega mansion there, and we put even more, property value on the shoreline than was there in the beginning. It just made the problem bigger. We're trying to find a needle in a haystack. We just added a bunch more hay. It's terribly helpful. So some kind of dual approach to make it easier for people to keep these places and not just have to sell out to somebody who's going to tear it down and build a thing and they're going to use for 2 holidays a year.
Frankly,
too, when that property is then also at risk.
Yeah, it's a risk.
Paying for that?
Who's paying for that? And that's the can that we're kicking down the road.
well, and the reality, again, as I said this earlier, is that home and the value of that property are providing income to the county that is taking care of other services for people in much underserved areas. So, there's that socioeconomic piece is huge, and it is oftentimes there is a fence there. There is no trespassing signs, as you say, and I think I've always just looked at when you have an existing stand, it has not just value to the owner itself, it has value to all individuals in the county because of the tax basis that's coming into the county. So you have to think about if that's gone, how do you replace that? A piece of property at Sunlight Beach that's unbuildable no longer has a 2 million or 6 million or whatever dollar value to it without a house.
Well, I don't think it helps these folks to be lumped into to be lumped in with the aforementioned mega mansion. Right. That's where blood pressures go in public.
That's
So by dividing that conversation, I think that be more traction, and more attention. Because in the end, we're all going to be affected by some element of this. I live in the woods where fire risk is going on. There's more likelihood that we're not going to be able to get insurance. How are we going to share these legacy risks as opposed to those that are full aware of their risk and come in to build anyway? Those are two different questions. And I think it's really important to bifurcate those discussions so that it's just on the basis of fairness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to share an example. 20 years ago, we always assumed we live in a pretty beach. All of a sudden, it's different. Pretty beach, not weird. And going out. All of a sudden, it changes. Suddenly, we're inundated with some tides, storm surges. Beach. And we said, no, we really state building. But we might let you one of our people got part of it. It's natural, great. Absolutely, that's it. So what if that doesn't work? Well, it should work. It shows it works. And it doesn't work to take it. One software that lasts 2 to 10 years. And then 160 pounds. 120 for a neighbor. Now we're saying, well, now we said we did something else. How would that work? So, allow that. Even if we wanted to, the state won't. Everybody knows it's working, lost, hurt, and growth in the process. Just not right.
Obviously, this conversation needs to happen, and this is not a great venue for us to figure that out.
My thought is everybody knows at least.
Well, it's definitely good to share the complexities of this, right? And I think what I'm hearing is it seems like there needs to be some separate, more concentrated conversations where there are certain aspects of, residential housing and sea level rise and these issues that are getting kind of fuzzy and compounded. And maybe there does need to be more focused attention for specifically this issue here in this county, because it is such a big, very complex issue that affects people in homes who live here. And I think that's kind of the key takeaway that I kind of take from here today is just having those focused.
I'm just wondering, you're mentioning that it's coming down from the state, but maybe this might not be the appropriate place to make headway on the conversation. So how does the group, or how does that get moved to the state level where the rules are actually in place? That might be the question.
I think it goes back to this gentleman's comment about how California has its own coastal committee. What type of committee is there to protect it? And help homeowners talk to legislature and get things changed.
Yep. This has been batted around for a long time. Since the King times have been really brought to a peak. And I agree with you, different stakeholders. There are other elements of the conversation that I'm very sympathetic to. And I agree. The level of frustration that you're showing is certainly, I appreciate your situation. But, I'm feeling a need to bring some kind of closure on this. And I think the main thing that I would say as a takeaway is that there is nuance in every piece of this. Every shore location, every neighborhood, every well, every homeowners association. This is a complicated bunch of people that like to be independent. And we're sharing a real crisis of how to manage with.
Absolutely. And I will note, we do have 5 minutes left, so I'll take a few more comments, of course, and but just kind of for the sake of time, we will be kind of wrapping up in 5 minutes. But I know.
Yeah, thanks. Just for a little perspective, December 27th, 2022 was our big King Tide Day. On my stretch of beach, I had 6 houses where their foundations were breached. I had 40,000 gallons of seawater under my house. I mean, the time is now. This is very real stuff. It's not something to push off and think about and contemplate. This is the time to take some action, not push it around and contemplate and generalize.
That comment, I think is important to remind. For so long, this discussion has been something off in the future, often talked about in terms of their grandkids will deal with or whatever. The fact that from a planning perspective and from a county administration perspective, it needs to be dealt with this hurricane analogy that I'm using, rather than this sort of amorphic, off in the future thing. And I think that commitment has to be real. And if anything, this voice is, it can be any aspect. It could be a water well running dry. It could be someone on the shoreline. It could be a fire risk. The fact that it's here and now should be given the same urgency when we're talking about a work plan of emergency response. I mean, that's the gravity that we should address.
Absolutely.
I'm very grateful to the gentleman behind me and Jake's summary there too. It reminds me that that 2018 study predicted what sea level rise was going to look like in 2050. That 2022 King Tide confirmed the model exactly. It did exactly what we were expecting for 2050. So when you put King Tides and so on top of the kind of modeling that we're looking at, as Jake said and Jennifer behind him said there, we're here now. And it's also illustrated the need to involve a broader set of stakeholders in this conversation. And also the way that Island County is, we've delegated so much out to diking districts, to small water systems, to these separate historic beachfront communities. These are going to require separate conversations in each of these communities, because they each have separate and distinct needs. And it takes time to build a dialogue and build trust with these communities and get them fully engaged in what the future is going to look like for them and how we can work together to get there. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of manpower, but it's absolutely necessary. There's no way to shortcut that.
Absolutely. We have one comment back here.
To your comment about at state level, because we were at the state governs a lot of this. The Shoreline Master Program is at the level right now, and we all the opportunities. So we should. And the state level master planning, which goes down to how the county then governs. But to that, I honestly have a question I'm asking about all of the DNR staff here. How does S&P, the master program, which governs all the things we're all talking about, not the comp plan, how do they mesh together? What comes first? Is it moved to talk about the comprehensive plan level because the S&P will supersede it? We are all genuinely asking. I would love to know, and I'm sorry if that's a planning question. But I think that would help us understand, everyone in the audience, what governs what.
Emily can, but we are looking at the Shoreline Master Plan as part of the climate element. That is a major component. It actually says that. They did give us some guidance, and they said, make sure you're looking at things.
So our,
Your specific plan, as well as what the state regs are, and there's a sheet we're doing to kind of look at what the gaps and opportunities are.
just validity to ecology or the future one. So for instance,
The one is the draft. We'll call it the draft.
so
The
there's
one,
opportunities.
that's up to opportunities to edit, for sure. Yeah.
Clarify.
Okay, so there's a little bit of confusion because our SMP is currently the Board of County Commissioners to
Right.
send it to ecology. So it's almost final, I guess, is where we're at in this really weird limbo. So, thank you for coming. In my perfect world, you all would make recommendations for what needs to be in our SMP during the next update, depending on what happens with the current SMP and how it comes back from ecology. Yeah, but there are two different documents. Our shoreline element is nested in the comprehensive plan, and so yes, John should be looking at it, should be making recommendations and suggestions, and then that would feed into the policy that comes to the next one. So, yeah, I want to respect everybody's time, so I'm going to close it out. We certainly can have more dialogue after this. Staff will stay around, and I did want to really urge you, please, to send your friends and family and people to make comments on our website. Put their priorities, these sticky notes. We want people in the public to be putting their priorities on our website, and those will all be considered in this process. And we have 2 more of these workshops coming up, and I just want to say a big thank you to everybody here today. We weren't sure how this format was going to go and how this would work, and this was the first time that I've seen a group of people deal with the tensions the way my team has had to sit with the tension of this comprehensive plan and what we're being asked to do. So thank you. It's not easy, but thank you.
Yeah.